going into consulting is a little bit like Eevee, the Pokemon, and then you can go into so many different directions afterwards. It is, for better or worse, a bit of a sink or swim environment. Everyone is working a crap ton. Everyone feels super anxious about meeting deadlines. You have this perverse incentive to work as much as humanly possible. Every year, thousands of college graduates go into consulting. People go into business school to go into consulting. And I saw this recent study from 2022 that said, taken together with finance, 40% of Ivy League grads either go into finance or consulting. So what's the hype around consulting, and why are so many people so keen to get into it? In this video, I'm gonna break down some of my experiences in consulting and try to talk about the pros and the cons so you can decide whether or not it's actually worth it for you. This is not gonna be the kind of glamorous career fair spiel that you're gonna get from a recruiter. Yes, we're gonna talk about the good things, but really I also wanna focus on and try to make real the downsides of consulting, because I don't think that's something that you know when you're going into it, but as you've gone through it for a couple of years, those things start to matter a lot. So quick spiel, I worked in consulting for 2 years out of undergraduate doing economic consulting, antitrust consulting, and then after that I left to do strategy and operations at a large tech company. So my experiences span both what working in consulting was actually like, and then how those experiences have translated over to a completely different job, which is one of the common exit opportunities that people in consulting do. So the rest of the video is going to be in 3 parts. The first is what consulting is, because it's a pretty broadly used term. The second are the benefits of consulting, the good side. And then the last bit are the bad parts of a consulting, the downsides. And so if you want to jump ahead to the good things or the bad things, feel free to. There are timestamps down below. So first, I want to be pretty specific about what consulting actually is. So to consult just means to advise. So consulting is literally the business of selling advice. And so the type of advice that you sell depends on the type of problem that you're trying to solve. There can be technical problems, business problems, strategy problems, economic problems, the list goes on, right? And so you have a lot of different types of consulting because there are a lot of different types of problems. Typically, when people talking about consulting, they mean management or strategy consulting. This is doing strategy work at McKinsey or Bain or PwC. And you're really trying to solve kind of business strategic problems. These might be things like, should we break into the market? Should we sell a new product? How do we increase revenue, increase efficiency, and kind of these broad, high-level strategic questions. And strategy work is kind of figuring out the blueprint for how you should accomplish those things. In contrast, the implementation side of that is you've taken a strategy and now you try to operationalize it and actually go through the processes, the logistics of getting that thing to work. Spoiler alert, I did not do management consulting, but I've had a lot of friends who did, and a lot of my coworkers are former management consultants. I did a slightly different type of consulting, which is economic consulting. So in contrast, you're not typically working on strategy or management problems. You're not trying to figure out how to increase revenue. Instead, you're trying to answer a kind of economic problem that's related to litigation or antitrust. A common example of this is when 2 companies merge together, especially if they're 2 large companies. The government in the United States, that's the Department of Justice or the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, is concerned that a merger of 2 large companies is going to be bad for customers, that they're going to come together, they're going to raise prices. And the company is trying to make the other case, that actually the merger will be a good thing for them, that they need it to compete in the market, that it's beneficial for customers, yada, yada, yada. And so both sides are going to hire economists to figure out how to quantify those issues. So because of that, the work that you're doing and the content of the work is a little bit different. Instead of building slides and presentations to try to convince executives of a strategy, you are putting together data analyses, statistical models in order to causally prove that one thing will happen and try to predict what's going to happen in the future, or say that something was caused by something else in the past. I could probably make a whole video about those 2 types of consulting, but I think the pros and the cons are very similar between those 2. There's definitely a lot of overlap. So as I go on throughout the video, I'm gonna specifically highlight if there are pros or cons that are kind of unique to those individual roles, but otherwise, most things will be covering both of those. Pros of consulting. So there are a lot. I'm gonna talk about 5 in this video. Number 1 is going to be about the money, the prestige, the status. Second, related to that, is going to be the exit opportunities. Third is going to be the transferable skills that you learn in consulting that can be widely applicable to anything else you do afterwards. Fourth is going to be about the mentorship, the learning that you get. And then finally, the kind of cohort and the benefits of having a cohort. So first, just get the obvious one out of the way. A lot of people want to go into consulting because consulting is a very well-paying job. Out of undergrad, you can make 6 figures or very close to 6 figures as your first job out of college. So back when I joined in 2019, 2020, starting salaries were between 70 and 80,000. In addition to a starting salary, you also get a signing bonus anywhere between 5 and 20,000. And then you also get a year-end bonus in consulting. That can range widely depending on the firm. Some firms cap at a certain number, so 10,000, 15,000, etc. While some firms, the more that you work, the larger the bonus is. There can be a kind of linear or exponential scale. So if you work a crap ton of hours, you could potentially get a very, very, very large bonus at the end of the year. Now in 2024, salaries have only gone up. So starting salaries range anywhere from 80,000 to even 110, 120,000 for your first job out of college. It's ridiculous. And that's largely one of the reasons I think people go into consulting. In addition to the money, it's also seen as something that is very prestigious, especially if you work at one of these larger strategy consulting firms, the most popular of which, McKinsey, Bain, BCG, MBB. And in addition to the kind of clout that it carries, I think it is something that carries on afterwards when you leave consulting. Especially in the business world, there are so many people who are former consultants. And for better or worse, when people see consultants, at least former consultants, when they see consultants, they use it as a heuristic for a certain set of skills. So even now, as we're doing recruiting for the broader team, and as I've gone through a lot of interviews with candidates, sometimes you'll say, oh, that person is a ex-Bain consultant. That person is an ex-McKinsey consultant. They have a consultant profile. And then sometimes you'll see an economic consultant and say, oh, that person has an economic consultant profile. They're from Cornerstone or Analysis Group. And you know, based on just that alone on someone's resume, the type of skills that they might have. So this person might be really good at presentations and speaking to clients. This person might be really good at building models and data analysis. And it's a shortcut to have someone believe that you're competent. Again, don't know if that's necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. It's just something that I've seen happen, especially when you're staring at a stack of 200 resumes and you're trying to shortlist that and filter through to see who would be a good fit. Probably rambled on there a little bit. That's something we will get more into in the exit opportunities point. But yeah, it's real. You get a lot of money and there is a lot of status and kind of prestige associated with it. But I think only in certain circles. If you talk to someone who's not in the consulting business world, they could probably care less what firm you work at or if you do consulting. I think it's so broad a term that when you tell someone you do consulting, it really could mean anything unless someone is in that world. Okay, that leads me to point number 2, which is exit opportunities. So one of the biggest sells of consulting, whether economic or management, is that there are a lot of different exit opportunities that you can do because the skill set that you learn is so transferable. In my experience, that has not been oversold. I've seen former consultants go into so many different things. The most common path is business school. So people know that consulting is a stepping stone. They don't expect you to stay around for a really long time. So people do their 2 to 4 years and then they go on to business school. And business school placement is incredibly good. There's like the M7, right, of like the 7 best business schools in the United States. And almost every single person that I've seen work in consulting has gone on to one of those top schools if they choose to go to business school. The other options that I've seen people pursue, this is probably more common in economic consulting where you work closely with lawyers and policy and you're doing a lot of kind of statistical modeling. I've seen people go do a PhD in economics. I've seen people go into law school. I've also seen some people go into medical school. I guess that one's less common exit opportunity, but it's still possible. There's also people who go into public policy, working for think tanks, governments, or going back to school for public policy. Overall, you just develop really good hard skills that can transfer over to these other domains. The other really common opportunity that I see people go into outside of going to school is working in industry. The most common exit opportunity I've seen is probably working in tech. It's also the exit that I myself made after working consulting for 2 years. And there's a very big natural overlap in the skills that you use in a consulting role versus the skills that you use in a strategy and operations role. I talked about this a little bit in my previous video, so I probably won't go into too much detail here, but there's a lot of overlap. That is something that has not been oversold. It's true. The last exit opportunity that I've seen, and this one's a little more specific to economic consultants because you work with data a lot and you're actually using programming languages, is I've seen a lot of former economic consultants go directly into data scientist type roles, even if that's not what they studied in college. So a lot of the former econ consultants that I knew studied economics, were kind of interested in the academic side of it. Maybe they studied math or statistics, but there wasn't a really strong CS or programming background. But because of the skills that you learn in economic consulting, it's really easy to then transfer over to become a data scientist if you want. The way I think about it sometimes, like going into consulting is a little bit like Eevee, the Pokemon, and then you can go into so many different directions afterwards depending on what you want to specialize in. Point 3, and I've already alluded to this a lot, is the hard transferable skills that you can use once you leave consulting. All these things are related, right? Like the reason why there are so many exit opportunities is because you learn so many skills. I'm going to specifically talk about 2 here that I think consulting helped me to really develop. The first is to think like an analyst and to know how to do data analysis. I think there's a big misconception when we talk about data that it's about the tool that you use, that it's about the programming language that you use, your ability to kind of know formulas in Excel. And that's important, yes, that's definitely a part of it. But I think what's far more important than that I did not learn in school, is the ability to think analytically and what that really means. So maybe the best way to talk about this is with an actual example. So let's say that you are a data analyst for Nike, and you have 3 years of data and you're trying to figure out what Nike sales have been over the past 3 years, what products are working well, not working well, and you need to give a diagnostic to the CEO, whatever. Sounds relatively straightforward, right? Well, in reality, these kinds of things get a lot more complicated. So let's say that your data is spread across 3 different sources. It's different spreadsheets. Let's say your products are named different things across those spreadsheets, and that they're in different currencies as well. Some are in USD, some are in yen, some are in pesos, and you need to be able to convert all that in order to have the spreadsheets talk to each other. So what was once maybe a very simple task now got a lot more complicated. It got a lot more messy. How do you approach this question? How do you clean the data? These are the kind of things that you learn when you're starting to work as an analyst and develop an analytical mindset. In addition to that, let's say the person who gave you the data, because you didn't pull it yourself, told you, hey, I actually have no idea if this captures everything. Like, this might capture some markets, this might not capture other markets. So how can you have confidence in the data? That's another skill that you develop as a consultant. You learn how to sense check things. So just making up an example, let's say that your revenue in Canada was 30 times higher than your revenue in the United States. Just based on the size of those markets, that probably doesn't make a lot of sense. That's something that instantly kind of alerts you that something is wrong with the data. Your ability to sense check is going to be really important. And in addition to that, your ability to scale and build something that is easily refreshable. And what that means is like you can change the data or refresh the data and your model still works. And so you need to be able to build models that are very flexible and refreshable. Because let's say the person who gave you the data is like, hey, 1 week later, I have some new data. I found the issues with the prior one. Can your model take that data and then spit out results very quickly? Something that you don't get a lot of practice in school. Like even if you work on statistical labs, you're usually working on one project, 1 week, 2 weeks at a time. You're not really working with scenarios where you're taking very similar data, but it just changes slightly. Another really important skill that I think consulting teaches you really well is communication. And communication is one of those things that everybody talks about, everybody kind of recognizes as this really important thing, but it's not entirely clear, or at least it wasn't really clear to me in college, what it actually means to be a good communicator. Because I don't think any of us think that we're bad communicators, but there is a very specific type of communication that I think you learn in the adult working world that consulting does prepare you well for. There are a couple of things that I've noticed. One is good structure. So whether you're giving a presentation or writing an email, it's really important that whoever is reading that or whoever your audience is able to follow your points logically. Like, does point A connect to point B, connect to point C? It's kind of like the 5-body paragraph thing, right? Like each body paragraph should sequentially meet the logic of the previous one. If your points are kind of jumping around a lot, then it's hard to follow, then it's not easy to understand what you're actually trying to communicate. I love this phrase that I heard probably a couple days ago, that communication is not necessarily about the intention, it's about what gets received. So it's a matter of if your audience understands what it is that you're trying to communicate. Which leads me to this other quote, I forget exactly where it's from, but the biggest pitfall of communication is thinking that it happened. So you might think that you said something, and you might think that your audience understood what you're actually trying to say, but they might not. And so that gap is where a lot of confusion comes from. So structure is one thing. Second thing, very related to that, is your ability to understand your audience and understand what they care about, and then give them information that meets those needs. One of the biggest ways that this comes up in work is depending on who you're communicating to. If you're communicating to someone at your same level, another analyst, you probably will not talk in the same way when you're communicating up to your manager or communicating up to someone in the C-suite. And the reason why that is one, there are power dynamics there. I'm not going to pretend that doesn't exist. And so there's a level of casualness at this level that's not going to be the same at this level. That's one. But two, the level of detail that someone's going to care about and what information is important to them is also going to differ quite a lot. And the rule that I've seen so far is the higher up that you're talking to, the more simplification that happens, because the less bandwidth they have to care about all the details. So let's say you did some analysis, say it's a Nike one, you found some findings. The analyst is gonna care a lot about the messiness in the data because they're gonna wanna understand your methodology, whether or not you're doing things the right way, and they can speak the same language as you. If you're talking up to your manager, they're probably gonna care a lot more about the results and whether or not you can produce those results. And then finally, if you're presenting up to someone even higher up, they don't necessarily care about what you did or how you did it. They might ask you to show your work, but generally they might just trust that you know what you're doing and that you're giving them a credible answer. So all this stuff at the bottom of how you clean the data, how you brought the spreadsheets together, doesn't matter this way. Probably matters a lot more this way. You see this in presentations, you see this in emails, and we call it kind of talking at different altitudes and the ability to kind of zoom up at like this 10,000 altitude range. It's one of those like corporate jargony things, which does kind of make sense. Or then your ability to drill down and look at details. And so understanding your audience is trying to understand like what do they care about and then giving them the thing that they care about. The final thing that I'm gonna talk about, and it's a pretty broad category, is kind of showing thoughtfulness and your ability to show your work and anticipate. And what I mean by this is in the working world, something that I've realized is that people don't explicitly always communicate what they want. And one reason why is because they don't know what they want. So there is a lot of interpretation that happens. There's a lot of clarifying that happens. And something that people are looking for, even if they're not asking it, is your ability to anticipate what they're gonna ask for next. So let's take the Nike example. Let's say you cleaned your data and now you found that products A, B, and C are decreasing in revenue. The next question, even if someone hasn't asked it yet, is why is it decreasing in revenue? Can you understand the root causes of that? And then drill down until you have something that is a root enough of a cause that you can go and solve it, or at least address it with some type of action. Even if that's not the initial question that someone asked you, that probably is the next thing that they're gonna be thinking about. And it's something that as a consultant, you kind of develop this muscle around of, oh, the reason they're asking me this question is actually this question. And they might not give you this question. I mean, you can ask and they should give you somewhat of an answer if they know what they're looking for. But if they don't know what they're looking for, then sometimes it falls on you to be able to chase that down and then kind of go with it. That said, it is always important, obviously, to clarify what it is you're actually doing so that you're not wasting time. And thoughtfulness is this big thing that kind of combines understanding your audience, what they want, but also your ability to ask yourself good questions and then chase down the answers to those questions. The next benefit of consulting is really about the learning and the mentorship that you get. And I think this is built into the consulting structure. So there are two levels to it. There is the peer group level, where you have a lot of people who are just a couple of years ahead of you in your career, and they make really great mentors, and they can kind of show you what life might be like in a couple of years. They can give you advice on your day-to-day problems because those are the same problems that they probably faced just a couple years earlier. And so there's a lot of pure mentorship that takes place in consulting. There's also a lot of management and higher level coaching that I've seen as well, because in addition to your peer group, you also have a lot of different managers. And consulting, depending on the type of firm you're at, you can work with a lot of different managers and learn from a lot of different people. So this kind of goes in two directions, right? You are figuring out what kind of fit you like in a manager and what the qualities you like in a team. And then at the same time, you're learning from people who have very different experiences and who can teach you very different things. So some might be amazing at client communication and you can learn something from them. Some people might be really good at facilitating meetings or driving analysis or being very organized, and you can learn something from them as well. There's this phrase that sometimes gets used to describe consulting, where a year in consulting is worth 3 years in industry. It's probably a hyperbole, but I think it does speak to the steep learning curve that you get in consulting and your ability to really pick things up quickly. Part of that is just because you're learning from so many different people around you. Another part of that is by nature of what you do as a consultant, you are literally, as an outsider, jumping into some business's problem, trying to understand everything about that problem and the relevant parts of the business associated with it. And then you're trying to come up with thoughtful solutions to it. So you really have to get good at asking questions. You really have to get good at learning things quickly. And it is, for better or worse, a bit of a sink or swim environment. Like, yes, you get onboarded, you get training, and there are a lot of people around you to help. But at the same time, the pace of consulting is so fast because they're trying to meet client deadlines, lawyer deadlines, etc. And so you ride this steep learning curve and you get a bunch of the other benefits that we talked about earlier. Something else that I really loved about the mentorship within consulting is your ability to be a mentor to someone else early in your career. So same thing, right? You have a couple of people who are older than you, but then as you get into your second year, your third year, now all of a sudden you're the kind of more senior associate and you have all these incoming undergraduates who want to learn from you. And so really early on in your career, you're still in like your early 20s potentially, you can be this kind of mentor, pseudo manager to somebody else. Now that I've joined the industry world in tech, that's something that's really, really rare. Like early on in your career, you do not get the experience of mentoring or kind of managing other people. But like second year into consulting, I was managing this kind of team of 2 or 3 analysts, kind of managing in quotes, but I was responsible for kind of supervising their work, delegating stuff out to them. And for me, I absolutely love that. Like I love being in a position where I can help other people and help them succeed. And this in some ways connects to the final point, which is you have a built-in network of friends. When you join consulting, you typically join as part of a cohort, and the classes above you and the classes below you are also all cohorts, and they can range in size from 5 people to 50 people. It really depends on what firm you work at and what office you're at. And I love that. Like if you're moving to a new city, all of a sudden you have all these people who are, similar interests, around the same age, who are just excited to be there too. And you have this built-in network of friends who you can learn from and who you can teach as well. And it makes this really supportive environment. Like it gets tough in consulting, the hours are long, and that's like the first con that I'm going to talk about a little bit. But it really helps when you have really great people around you. And from my experience, like the people I worked with were some of the smartest and most collaborative people that I've ever met. Like there was never any issue of like people competing with each other or backstabbing or sabotaging and all those kind of horror stories that you hear about sometimes. Had absolutely none of that. Like the people that I worked with were probably the biggest draw for why I even did consulting in the first place. So that's all the good stuff. And now we're gonna talk about the bad stuff. And if you made it this far in the video or you just skipped ahead, then you're probably asking yourself if the good things outweigh the bad things. And for everyone, that's gonna be a very personal judgment call. So I wanna make sure at least you understand the other side of the scale and what you might be trading off. Because some of these things, they can feel very conceptual. So I wanna make those things feel a little bit more real. So you understand the day-to-day grind of what actually being in consulting was like. There are 3 tangible points that I wanna make in this section, and then probably one of a more philosophical point. 3 things. 1, the mental health, the grindiness of the work, and the toll that can take on you. The second is gonna be about the content of the work itself and how it can be very boring and sometimes very tedious. The third point is gonna be about impact and whether or not you actually have an impact or sometimes even potentially have a negative impact on society. And the final more philosophical point is really about how it can potentially give you a more myopic view of the world. So 4 things. Number 1, and this is a meaty one, this is a big one, this is one that is well known and well talked about, but it's still hard to understand until you're actually in it, is how big of an impact working in consulting can have on your mental health and how much you work in consulting. So last year, or 2 years ago now at this point, there was a really famous news story about analysts at Goldman Sachs who were complaining after working multiple 70, 80-hour plus weeks and formed like a mini union. And this broke the internet because everyone was like, holy shit, these people are working so many hours and why are they doing this? Why is it so bad? These are like smart people who are working at a reputable firm. And this is one of those things that kind of everyone knew about investment banking, and it was still such a shock to so many people. Consulting, I don't think is as bad as investment banking in terms of the sheer number of hours that you work, but it's still pretty bad. I think management consultants probably average at least 50 hours a week, oftentimes more than 60 hours a week, and that's adding in the travel that they do to get to client sites as well. In economic consulting, my experience probably hovered more around 50 to 55 on an average week. And so you're thinking 10, 12-hour days, and then oftentimes working on weekends as well. So there's like this sheer, you're working a crap ton part of it. But I don't think it's just the sheer number of hours that you're working. There's like this other element to it too, which is the anxiety that comes with it and the pace that you're being pushed at to meet client deadlines, to meet lawyer deadlines. And it's always about trying to meet client expectations and kind of bending over backwards to do that. So if your partner is doing that because they want to maintain a good client relationship, they want to continue having that business, then they're really going to push the rest of their team to work really, really hard. And I think that's something that permeates all level of consulting that I've seen. Like the analysts are not working harder than the managers or the partners. If anything, what I've seen is that the partners and managers are working even more than the analysts because they're also communicating with the clients, they're trying to keep them happy. And I've seen a lot of people make a lot of sacrifices in their personal life in order to maintain that level of success. It is something that I've seen at every level of consulting. Everyone is working a crap ton. Everyone feels super anxious about meeting deadlines, and it's not great for your mental health. And I think in addition to the number of hours worked and the anxiety, there's this nagging feeling that you have to be responsive at all times. And especially at the junior level, I don't know if this is the case for everyone. It definitely was the case for me and a lot of the people that I worked with, is there's this feeling that you have to say kind of yes to everything when you are early on in your career. And there's a big reason for that. It's like when we think back to the exit opportunities that we talked about, a lot of them are grad school. And you know what you need to get into good grad schools? You need to stand out from your peers. You need to have good letters of recommendation. And how do you have good letters of recommendation? You got to make your managers like you. And your managers are going to like you if you do good work. And so the person who does a lot of things, who's always responsive and checking email, is going to stand out and in some ways look like a better performer than the person who's not, who's going to check messages every couple of hours, is not as responsive. And this is just the reality of working. I don't think this is specific to consulting, but it was especially bad in consulting because so many people are going to grad school and you're already in this cohort. So you're trying to figure out a way to stand out from this cohort. On top of all that, I talked about this a little bit in my last video, but your performance is directly tied to the number of hours that you work. So you have this perverse incentive to work as much as humanly possible, because not only does it increase your odds of getting a better bonus, it also increases your ability to stand out, because literally every hour that you work is more money that's being brought into the firm. And so you are a better asset, a more valuable and profitable asset than someone who works fewer hours. It really distorts your way of thinking. It is a really kind of messed up way of thinking about, and it's something that I personally really did not like. I did not like it from the moment I joined consulting. I was so relieved when I finally left consulting, and I no longer had to keep track of like how I spent every single hour of my workday. I want to contextualize this a little bit, especially for those of you who are in college and are using that as your reference point. College can be a very stressful experience, and the most stressful experience oftentimes is finals exams, where everything feels like it's on the line. You've been working all semester towards this goal of trying to get good grades, and now you have this one exam that's going to determine a huge part of your grades. That's really stressful, right? Finals exams were far less stressful than some of the experiences I've had in consulting chasing deadlines. And I think of the times where I've been up at 4, 5, 6 a.m. responding to emails, trying to figure out something last minute that we're going to send and submit for a deadline the day afterwards. I think of the times where I'm sitting and eating dinner. This is during COVID, so sitting and eating dinner in a small apartment, haven't really interacted with anyone all day. And I'm thinking of all the stuff that I still have to do. And I've gotten stress headaches in consulting. I've never once got a stress headache during college or any time prior to that. But thinking back to some of these in the trenches periods of consulting, just thinking about it kind of raises my cortisol levels a little bit. Those were probably the most intense periods. They're not representative of all the other periods, but I think that goes to show how just intense those times can be and how stressful that is. I think that kind of lives in your body in a way that takes time to process and kind of recover from afterwards. The second bad thing about consulting is just how boring it can be sometimes and how tedious the work is. So at the career fair, people will tell you how sexy consulting is, how you can work across multiple different cases and industries and work with all these kind of big companies. And that can be true. You can work on these really sexy cases with really big companies that are on the news. At the same time, you can also work on cases doing things that absolutely no one has heard of before. You can be a random commodities company, industrial company, farming company, whatever it is, right? But what matters actually a lot more than the type of project that you're on and how well known the firm is the actual content of the work that you're doing. And that's where it can get very tedious and very boring. And there's kind of a guiding principle to all of this, which is consultants are hardos for formatting, for consistency, to making sure that everything looks standardized and templatized. There is no individual expression, especially when it comes to writing expert reports, presentations, models. It's all kind of standardized away. And so what you're left doing is trying to fit into a template. 2 examples of this. First, doing a presentation. So management consultants typically build a lot more presentations than economic consultants. I don't think I ever did a PowerPoint as an economic consultant. In management consulting, you are building presentations all the time. And you know what this means? This means making pretty slides that tell a story. And it's a very effective skill. It's definitely something that you use in other parts of the business world as well. But what this ends up meaning is that you're spending a lot of time making sure that fonts are the same size, making sure that they look good. And the joke is that you're spending hours in your day just moving boxes around. And that's largely true. Like even in my role right now, doing strategy at a tech company, a lot of my day sometimes is spent moving boxes around on a PowerPoint. And there's a reason behind it. You're trying to simplify and communicate an effective story, but the over optimization that can take place because you're trying to get something perfect is so boring. Sometimes when you get it right, it's very satisfying, it clicks. But imagine you're just aligning 5 boxes on a page or moving things up or down a little bit. It's really not that fun. On the economic consulting side, the tedium came really in the data and in what we call DMing. So data's messy. Very rarely do you ever get a clean data set where you can ingest it immediately and start analyzing it. Oftentimes there are things in the data that you have to be aware of and you have to spend a lot of time checking. So for example, let's say that you have two data sets and they don't match. You have to figure out how they match. And let's say that you have to build a mapping. We call this a crosswalk to link different data sets together. And you have to look up the addresses of different companies to make sure that they're accurate. Imagine you have 1,000 rows, 1,000 different addresses that you have to manually go on Google and look up to make sure that they're the right addresses, that the company still exists. Super boring. You can also be doing that if you're looking at revenue data and you don't have a revenue database. So you're just on Google, you're looking up manually the revenue of 50 different competitors, 100 different competitors. The list can go on. And sometimes that can take a couple hours. Sometimes that can be entire days or weeks if the list that you're going through is a super large list. In addition to that, in economic consulting, you don't do this in management consulting. You do what's known as data management. We call it DMing for short, where you have two people independently doing the same thing and checking each other's work. And the bar for rigor is so high because you have to pass over your work on the other side, and you have a team of analysts on the other side who are going to do the same thing and try to find every single little mistake that you've made. And so imagine you've gone through 1,000 different rows of data, you've checked them. Now you're passing that on to someone else and they're gonna check them and they're gonna do the same thing. They're gonna pass on whatever they've done and you're checking them. Not fun. In addition to that, there's also the DMing or the reviewing, auditing of reports. So in economic consulting, oftentimes the end deliverable of what we're producing is a super long 50 to 150 page expert report where the expert signs their name and say, this has my stamp of approval, the economic analyses are good. You're trying to convince a lawyer that your case is better than the other side's case. In the process of writing that report, you're literally going through every single sentence, every single punctuation mark, and trying to make sure that there is no mistake. At a micro level, you're trying to make sure that there's no typos. You're trying to make sure all the commas are in the right place, nothing is misspelled, the font is all the same. Not that fun. You do, however, on the bright side, develop a very sharp attention to detail. The joke that is often made is now you can tell Calibri 11 from Arial 12 from Times New Roman 13 and all the little micro nuances of font sizes. Yes, that's true. You develop that skill and that muscle, but at what cost? The third bad thing about consulting is the questionability of the impact. And I mean this in two different ways. The first is literally questioning whether or not you have an impact, because oftentimes you're working on cases that are very long-term. This is for economic consulting. You've been working on a project that has taken place over 3, 4, 5 years. And if you're only there for 2, you have no idea how that case is actually going to close. You don't know how your work is going to impact the decision. And you just have no idea. The time horizon is too long for you in the couple of years that you're there to know whether or not you've meaningfully had an impact, whether your analyses are actually getting used or shown in court. You have a very similar problem on the management consulting side, but instead of your problem being a long horizon, your problem is you don't know if what you're producing is actually going to get used. So if you're a high-level strategy consultant, oftentimes you're producing this big blueprint, it's fancy with all the different things that you can do, and then you're handing it off either to the client or another team to figure out how to implement it. And they can decide not to implement it at all, or if they do implement it, it might not go according to the plan that you've laid out. And there's really no incentive for you to stay on that project. You have no skin in the game to see how it works. So it can be very dissatisfying to see all the months of work that you've done into a binder of this grand strategy, and then it never gets used. So you actually have had no impact on the firm. It's just this nice, beautiful thing on paper, but it never gets used and you never see any value realized from it. The second point is not about questionable impact, but negative impact. So if you are working on a case where maybe you disagree with the client and what they're doing, maybe you disagree with the social impact that they have on the world, you still might have to work on that case. Like going back to the earlier point of exit opportunities in grad school, like you want to look good in front of your manager. And if you are raising complaints, which you perfectly have a right to do so, it has the consequence of making you potentially look like a less desirable person to work with. And so there's kind of like all this pressure to just like work on whatever case or project that you get assigned on. And the cases that people are working on, think about it, like who has the money to hire expensive consulting firms? Usually large corporations who have literally thousands and thousands of dollars to shell out so that someone else on the outside can come in and solve their problems for them. You think about some of the cases that appear on the news. I think the most scandalous recent one is McKinsey being involved with the opioid cases. And John Oliver did this huge bit about it. You can watch that video. I think it goes into such great detail about some of the negative consequences of the work that consultants can do. And think, as you know, an analyst out of undergrad, these are potentially the kind of projects that you might work on. In economic consulting, you have a similar potential ethical dilemma, but I think it's a bit better than management consulting. And I think the reason why is typically you have two sides of an argument. Both sides have lawyers and both sides have economists. And at least for the economic portion of it, it has to be pretty statistically sound because of what I talked about earlier. You're literally giving your analyses over to the other side, and it has to make sense. It has to be logical, and you can't BS. You just cannot BS. That being said, however, the large corporation that has a ton of money to shell out is probably going to be able to hire a more well-resourced team than, say, potentially a government agency or a smaller company. And so you don't necessarily have the good guy winning in these cases if there's a good guy and a bad guy. You usually have the person who has the bigger wallet winning these cases. And the person with the bigger wallet tends to be the people who hire the most expensive consultants. The final point is more of a philosophical point, and I haven't really baked it out. It might just end up being me rambling for a couple minutes, but I think working in consulting can breed a myopic definition of success. And I don't think this is specific to consulting, but I do think it is much more perverse within consulting, which is in some ways the pinnacle of conventional success. You think about the path that people take to get into consulting. It's oftentimes going to an elite school, getting really good GPAs, and then going right out of undergrad. Or for other people, you work in industry for a couple of years, you go to a top business school, and then you go into consulting. And you make a lot of money, it's prestigious, it's potentially highly influential, and it is very, very conventional. And I don't mean that as a negative thing, but because it's so conventional, it makes it very difficult to break out of that. There's a lot of research that's been done on happiness and relative well-being. And what matters a lot in these cases is not how you are positioned relative to the rest of society, but how you are positioned relative to your peer group. That's why it's called relative well-being. And if you imagine that your entire peer group is a bunch of overachievers who are making a ton of money, who are working a lot, and that is the world that you become used to, there's a lot of gravity to stay in that world and to not do something else. Because if all your peers are making a ton of money and then you go off and try to do something that's very risky, let's say you try to become a writer or do something else that just doesn't make a lot of money, there is just so much potential judgment that comes from that. Maybe I say this because I come from a Chinese immigrant background. Like, my parents came from China, they immigrated to the United States, and though they weren't tiger parents, there's very much that stereotype of like pushing for education, financial stability, success, and consulting, engineering, doctor, lawyer, etc. It falls into that group of like stable financial. And once you're in that world, when you do something else, you feel like an outsider and that you might be shunned for doing that. And maybe it's not even, as I say it out loud, the external pressure of like, oh, will people judge me? Will people shun me? Maybe it's the internal pressure of, am I an idiot if I walk away from this? You hear the term sometimes called golden handcuffs. Usually gets applied to people working in a large tech company doing software engineering where you're making a ton of money. So why would you walk away from it? But at the same time, do you really love what you're doing? Are there trade-offs that you're making? And is that decision worth it? And so it's called a golden handcuff. And I think consulting and other industries like it are very similar. You're here, you're doing something that seems sensible, that follows convention. Why would you leave? Final parting thought on that one, as I reflect on my own question of why would you leave. I think when you realize the things that you've been chasing don't give you the happiness you thought they would, that's when you leave. And now, being on the other side of that, having done consulting, with consulting being the thing that I was chasing ever since I was a junior in college and taking econ classes and math classes and recruiting in order to get to that point, and realizing that point wasn't gonna give me everything that I wanted to, there's a disillusionment that comes with that is painful. But I think it also opens up your way of thinking about work, about the world, and what meaning actually is. I think I had this notion in college that I was going to find a lot of fulfillment in work and a lot of purpose in it. And I still believe in that. I do think that work plays a huge part in our lives in providing purpose and fulfillment. But I no longer give it the same weight that I used to as a bright-eyed undergrad kid. And I'm both thankful for that. Also a bit saddened. I think there's a bit of idealism that gets lost in that. But I think it also prepares me much better as I look into what I want my career, what I want my life to look like. It's a reality check. And it was a wake-up call that I think I needed, because I think you hear people who chase after success, they have these stories, but they don't really stick. Like, those things don't really mean a lot until you've had that experience for yourself. So to wrap up all of this, is consulting worth it for you? Was it worth it for me? I don't know. It's the life path that I've chosen. I've learned a lot from it. I am in some ways very satisfied with my life, and in some ways not. It's still a very much work in progress type thing. Consulting is not going to be end all be all, solve all your answers and be like this amazing job. But at the same time, it's not this terrible thing either. It's quite complex and messy. I'm not sure how much of that made sense. I hope some of it resonated with you. But if you're interested in what happens after consulting and potentially what you can do if you're interested in tech, then my last video was about that. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I do respond to almost all questions that I get in the comments or on Instagram, and I'm here to help. Peace.